Do. Welcome to Office Hours, ladies and gentlemen, coming to you live from Las Vegas, from my home studio in Las Vegas. Often I do these all over the place with all kinds of, let me show, why isn't it showing PoleGab up there? What? That's odd. It's not showing PoleGab. Let's see if we can refresh that. Let's turn it off and turn it back on. Well, now, why is that not showing anything? Oh, no, there it goes. There it goes. Oh, okay, cool. Whew, God, technology. It's been a while since I've done one of these live from the home office. Good to see you, Surly Dev, too. I saw your chat thing come through there. Folks, if you have questions about the Microsoft Data Platform, you can ask them up there, up at the top. Certainly, if I had the same question, like everything is all over the place, trying to get everything set up. This is also the first time I've used a brand new version of OBS. There's a new screen sharing tool or a streaming tool. Oh, David, good to see you too. Do you want me to ask that on PoleGab? That's funny. How's everyone doing? I am doing quite well, although a little frazzled there at the last minute because right as I was going live, I noticed that I'm dropping a ton of frames going to Twitch, like dropping a whole lot of frames streaming out. And I didn't know whether that was a problem with OBS or what it was. And I went running into my home theater. On the other side of this camera wall, there's on the other side of this wall, I'm in a home office, there's my home theater is right over there, and that's where the Ethernet is, and I had forgotten to plug in the Ethernet. I was just running over Wi-Fi, which is fine, for when I'm just like surfing the web or whatever. But if I'm going to be streaming to you fine people, I need to have all of the Ethernet bandwidth that I can get. So I'll be going through the questions in the order that they are upvoted on there. So if there's an answer or a question that you want to see or an answer you want to hear, go over to polegab.com/room/Brento and you can vote from over there. The first question, the highest voted question, is from George Dax. George says, "Hello, Brent. I'm dealing with a huge sales table which contains around 500 columns with 50 million rows. Business wants to be able to add even more columns in the table. Should I break the table or keep adding columns to the same one? Performance-wise, what's the best approach?" Okay, so in my work, most of my work is emergency performance tuning, and I can't tell people just simply break a table apart and change your application, because whenever you take an existing table and break it into pieces, that usually involves extensive application changes. There is a cheat you can use, which is you rename the table, break it up into pieces, and then you put a view pointing to those tables, but you have to use left out or join, so that way it's optional as to which extra columns you join to. What I would say is at 500 columns, you're pretty far past the point where you should consider putting a fork in it and going and building other tables. You may not be able to change the existing table. You may have too much code and too many applications. Hey, Drew! Hey, good to see you, man. You may have too many existing applications that can't be changed because of the numbers of code that's been lying around for years. People don't want to recompile it. But anything new that you do from this point forward, you should consider adding separate tables and normalizing the database. If you want to learn more about how that works, Lewis Davidson has an excellent book, and I've been meaning to review this book on the blog for quite a while. This is Pro-Relational Database Design. There aren't a lot of books out there. You do indeed, sir. You can give you an extra. There aren't a lot of books out there that are currently updated for relational database design because, frankly, to be honest, you don't need a brand new book to cover database design. Database design has been roughly the same for the last, let's say, 20 years. There have been small changes, but it hasn't been dramatically different. If you want to just get started with the latest and greatest, though, this book, Pro-Relational Data Modeling by Lewis Davidson, is focused on the SQL Server space, but really the basic idea holds true across any database platforms. It's kind of related. Next up, with the next highest voted one is Burnjar. Brinjar says, do you have a suggested max column limit when designing? Oh, that's very sweet of you, Pittsburgh, or of Drew. Do you have a suggested max column limit when designing new tables that require fast queries? No, for me, I would just say, hey, look, by the time you get to 50 columns, you probably haven't normalized it enough. There are designs, absolutely, out in the world that require more than 50 columns on a table and that are properly normalized. But as you start to approach 50, that's where I go, hey man, let's hit the brakes. Let's stop and think about what it is that makes this row unique, what attributes are really relevant to the row versus what should be split off to child rows, or what doesn't need to go in the database altogether. What could be just dumped in XML on a file share somewhere and just cached by the application, only updated periodically. So if you're breaking things apart to that many columns on one row, I start to get suspicious. Next up, Manuel, Manuel Labor, one of my favorite jokes. When I say that something is going to be very labor intensive, I say that we're going to outsource it to the Spanish department of the company, and that department is run by Manuel Labor. What is the largest stored procedure that you ever had to optimize? How long did you spend on it? Back when I was a database administrator for a wine distributor out of South Florida, I had a stored procedure that was around 15,000 lines. And I don't want to say that, like, how long did you spend on it? It's not like I started one day and I finished another day. Working with that stored procedure was a continual pain in my rear, that like we continuously had to go back and take looks at it and go, okay, what can we change out of that process now to make it go faster? There's a client of mine that had a stored procedure that called hundreds of functions, and I'm going to say altogether it was probably 20, 30,000 lines long worth of code. The other part that's painful with that is when you have a stored procedure that calls other stored procedures, you can't just use SP Blitz Cache to say, give me the total CPU broken out by line, because you're going to, for one stored procedure, because that stored proc will call other stored procs and cause all kinds of problems. Next up, we have Yavin asks, when analyzing SQL memory use, what are healthy and unhealthy utilization ratios for memory clerk, buffer pool, cache store? So you don't want to tune SQL Server based on ratios of memory clerks. Instead, what you want to do is start with what's your SQL Server's top weight type. What's the top weight type, and then go from there. Whatever your top weight type is, generally that's what you spend most of your time performance tuning. There are edge cases where you have to look at the memory consumption for specific clerks, but I would just never want to tell you that I look for ratios between them. That's something that SQL Server does a pretty good job of managing itself. If you find yourself thinking that you're gonna tweak those manually, I think you're probably going down the wrong path. Next up, we have Eduardo, who asks, is it safe to run SP Blitz Index? No, no, no. You'll lose your job. It's terrible. Okay, now seriously, look at that question. Now here's the thing. What if I told you yes? What if I told you yes, it would safe? Would you believe some random yo-yo with a Twitch channel and a blog? What if I told you no? Would you just take me at my word and believe me forever? It's really cool to think that I have that much authority and power, but in reality, why don't you test it during a low period? Why don't you F around and find out? Why don't you try it in a development environment first? Then, Pittsburgh says, I would trust any man in those shorts. Try it in a development environment, try it in a QA environment, try it after hours, gradually amp up, and you'll see what the overhead looks like as you run it during higher and higher intensive times. But why would you just take the word of some yo-yo who just runs a Twitch channel? I mean, that come on, that's just insane. And I would tell you about that about anything that I say. Just because I tell you something doesn't mean you should treat it as a word of God. I've thought about doing one in my swim trunks because I have a pool in the backyard, and one in Cabo too. And I've been thinking about, could I do one just aimed like from here? I wouldn't want anybody to see my nipples. Like that's where I draw the line in terms of a webcast. I'd want to be like in water up to here and then only shooting from that. But anything that I tell you, you should go and test for yourself. You should F around and find out. Your favorite yo-yo. Exactly. And I could play games during the stream. I could be like any of the other kiddie pool streamers, and I'm sure I would be just as popular. Next up, Third Normal Form asks, heaps and vendor packages. I have a 43 million row table called transaction log with no keys and no clustered index. SP Blitz Cache shows 7 queries. I took the recommended composite index and I made it into a clustered index. Unifier, what is it? Really? That's your question? Okay, let me do what you just did with that question. I was born on a dark night in Germany. It was cold, it was raining. My mother had spaghetti for dinner. What is my name? I mean, you're just like throwing in all kinds of crazy, wacko things inside your question. Why didn't you just ask, what is a unifier? Oh, make sure to read the instructions that are up there on the screen. Why didn't you just ask, what is a unifier? Right? Like, what'd you need all the background for? I'm using a mechanical keyboard and a 27-inch 4K monitor. What is an index? Come on now. Just say it out loud. That's pretty good. So what is a unifier? All right, there's enough of that. What is a unifier? If you don't define your clustered index as unique, SQL Server will go behind you and add a unifier in there for you. To learn more about what that is, check out my class, Mastering Index Tuning. But the thing I'll shortcut and tell you is I wouldn't worry about it. If you are worried about that kind of thing, attend my Mastering Index Tuning class, but it's not something that you have to worry about. Next up, we have DB Architect Chick. I like that. Now, hi, Brent. I'm designing a new database for 50,000 inserts and selects per hour. I have to tell you something. I suck at math. I'm notoriously bad at math. Like even on client calls, clients will tell me I'm doing this many of something per day, and every time, and I don't even try to hide it, every time I have to get out a calculator. So I'm going to go get out a calculator because I'm really not that bright. 50,000 inserts per hour, inserts, selects, and whatever. 50,000 divided by 60 minutes an hour, divided by 60 seconds in a minute. Okay, that's 14 queries per second. 14 queries per second isn't really a lot, even when you've got a small amount of hardware, like say just 4 CPU cores. You should be okay. Don't overthink that in terms of the inserts. Inserts, 14 inserts per second, you could handle on a laptop. You'd be totally okay. What I'm worried about is the selects. Because sometimes you'll hear people say, well, I do 10 selects a second. Well, okay, what do they look like? Are they big, ugly data warehouse queries with like no where clause? Or are they very tiny select from table where ID equals 1, 2, 3, 4? Until you know more about the select, I actually wouldn't have an index strategy. Just put a clustered index on the table and that's it. Put a clustered primary key on there and call it a day. Circle back after the application goes live and then do your indexing strategy once you know which queries come in the most often. Because it's easy to change your indexing strategy later and you should expect it to evolve slowly over time. This is what I tell all my clients, all the developers. I know you'll hear from a lot of database administrators. Developers should understand how to create indexes. Developers should have a strategy for knowing. No. All developers should have to do is put a clustered primary key on every table and call it a day. Ship it. Tell the database what makes a row unique and store it in that way and walk away. Because it's easy for people to come back later and look at non-clustered index hints from the DMVs, look at the execution plans that run most often. Whereas when you're in the beginning, it's really hard to guess what parts of the application are going to be the most popular, and you're going to be wrong. Users are going to use your application in ways you never would have considered. People who have the greatest plans for here's how I believe users are going to use it. You're going to be stunned at how users use it like they're drunken donkeys banging on a keyboard through their hooves. They just do the wildest things with applications. So don't sweat it. It's admirable that you wanted to build a strategy. That's awesome. But don't worry about it. Just put a clustered primary key on every table and call it a day. Next up, let's see here. Eduardo asks, what is your opinion of Intel QAT backup compression in SQL Server 2022? Over the last 3 releases, so SQL Server 2016, 2017, and 2019, there have been a huge amount of bugs involving restores that didn't work. As in, if you had clustered column store indexes, if you combined TDE with compression, there were all these feature interoperability problems where the backup worked, the restore did not. If you want to laugh about these, go to SQLServerUpdates.com and do a search for restore. SQLServerUpdates.com, do a search for restore. And you'll see a huge number of cumulative updates from the last 3, 4, 5 years where restores didn't work. Like Fox Mulder, I want to believe, but I'll be damned if I'm going to be the first person to tell my clients you should adopt a brand new compression strategy in order to save space in your backups. Because backups are only worthwhile if you can restore. I want to believe, but because I don't desperately need another 20% in backup compression. Sure, it would be nice. I'm looking forward to it. It'll be cool to have. I just don't want to, as they say, F around and find out. I'd rather let that slide out through the first few cumulative updates as other people make the realizations of being unable to restore stuff. I'd rather they learn the hard way, because you do not want to be the database administrator who has to answer the help desk ticket with, I'm sorry, unfortunately, we can't restore that. And when they go, why? They go, well, because I decided to play around with a new backup compression feature. Don't be that person. Next up, Wilhelms asks, is there a good way to know when a query caused an AutoStats update and how long the AutoStats update took? Why? Why? What are you going to do about that? If you're looking for, because it's not the query's fault. It's not the query's fault that they triggered an auto update stats. It's your fault that you're not updating your database statistics. It's because your restore test never ends, David. So what problem are you trying to solve? My guess is the problem that you're trying to solve is we have auto update stats trigger firing off, and we're getting complaints from people that sometimes their queries are slow. What you can do instead is go look at sys.statistics or sys.stats, and there's an updated date in there, if I remember right. Go check to see statistics that were updated during the day, as opposed to the stats that were updated overnight during your maintenance window. Then go find out why you're triggering the stats updates thresholds, like how much of that table is changing and why, and go work on that solution rather than trying to find the poor select that accidentally stumbled into that and triggered the update, because it's just not, you're going down the wrong problem there. Could you do it? Absolutely, with extended events. You could roll your own extended event session and look for statistics updates moments. Why bother, though? And even if you really wanted to focus on that, just turn on asynchronous stats updates. Asynchronous stats updates is an option at the database level, and then that way the query can fire off and continue without being held up for the statistics update. Those are the two routes that I would take instead. Next up, Pete asks, what is your opinion or thoughts on the graph database feature that was introduced in SQL Server 2017? Have you worked with any clients that use it in production? No. Or is this another copycat feature to keep up with the database Joneses? Yes, it was a copycat feature with graph databases are becoming popular. We want that money. Let's just add a graph feature into SQL Server and see if it catches on. I love that Microsoft gives you the flexibility to put everything inside of SQL Server, because as someone who makes their living performance tuning when SQL Server is slow, I love it when Microsoft introduces slow features. However, I didn't actually make any money on that feature, not because it was fast, but because hardly anybody adopted it. Which makes rightful sense. There are plenty of mature, if you want to store graph data, there are plenty of mature, open source, free graph databases that you can choose from. I think if SQL Server is like the most expensive filing cabinet in the shop, it should be your last resort, not your first resort. Of course, it's not the most expensive. There's always Oracle, but you get the general idea. Next up, Radu DBA asks a question that people ask continuously. Is there still room for SQL Server and traditional on-premises databases? I work as a DBA and I do a lot of performance tuning. Is my career doomed? So if you search on brentozar.com for DBA job roles, there are a couple of different job roles. There's a production database administrator that keeps the server up and running, does troubleshooting on outages, troubleshooting on backups, etc. Then there's development DBA, which does performance tuning. Development DBAs are more in demand than ever. They're sometimes called different things, like companies are sometimes easier to get people hired under senior database developer or senior data engineer. But there are roles out there that involve making your database faster and cutting your cloud bills. Performance tuning, which is what I chose to specialize in when I saw this coming like over 10 years ago, I said, I want to be near whatever is seen as a cost savings job. So when I'm able to walk into a client, I can go, I will cut your cost, your cloud costs, and you will see it pay off in your very next bill, like your very next Amazon bill, your very next Azure bill, and so forth. That's so much better than on-premises, because on-premises, if you make things go faster, you don't get a refund. It's not like your on-premises costs go down next month because you did a good job tuning a query, whereas I can do that with clients. I can show them how to cut their spend bills every month. So that pays for itself really well. Those kinds of DBAs are doing well. Production DBAs are the ones who would probably genuinely have to be worried that more and more of their job is going to erode away due to automation. That's the theory. In the year 2022, with SQL Server 2022, did you see that feature now? How about when you go through the installation wizard with SQL Server 2022, it just asks you for the backup directory. It says, what directory do you want to back up your databases to, and what's your RPO and RTO? And then SQL Server automatically sets up backing up and restore testing and CheckDB for you. Do you see that feature? You didn't. So how long has SQL Server been around? What, 24, 25 years now? And they still won't even automatically set up backups for you on the install? I think these people are okay for a while. Next up, we have Serpil. It's like the color purple, I guess, but with cyborgs. Can you suggest a stored procedure source control tool? We have GitLab for source control, but we want to track all changes to stored procedures. Okay, so there's two ways you can do this. You can either do it before the stored procedure changes or after the stored procedure changes. If you want to do it before the change makes it to production, it's up to you. It's up to you to integrate it into your deployment processes, just like you would an application that you're going to check the source code into production or check the source code into source control before you deploy it to production. That is left up to my friend from Spain, Manuel Labor. It's up to you to decide what version control system you want to use. It can be anything, but there's nothing that really integrates tightly with databases. Redgate SQL source control kind of sort of says that they do it, but they don't at the end of the day because people can still go in and alter stored procedures. The other way that you can do it is after the stored procedure changes. You can either put in a DDL trigger, or you can have something go and patrol the database every 15 minutes looking for changes and then check them into source control. Those kinds of tools don't necessarily tell you who did it or why. They don't link back to a GitHub issue or a Jira issue. But if your goal is to see what the before and after versions were, those work beautifully. That's usually the first step for me, is just to put in at least automatic source control after the deployments happen, patrol something every 15 minutes. There are even database monitoring tools that do this, like Quest Spotlight will do this for you automatically, so that when you're looking at performance graphs, if performance on a stored procedure tanks, Spotlight can show you the before and after execution plan and the code too as well, which is kind of spiffy. And then we'll do one more. The last one we have highly voted from You Gotta Do What You Gotta Do is, hi Brent, have you ever encountered a very toxic work environment that created, and I laugh when I say it because of course yes, that created problems for you during your consultancy work? How did you handle this? Absolutely. Okay, so my first line of defense is during the sales call. I have a sales call, it's a free 30-minute sales call where the client sends me in their data first, and then we walk through the data and I say, tell me what it is that you're having a problem with, and what does success look like to you? At the end of our engagement together, what are you going to say? Thank God we hired Brent because he blank. What's that blank? And then when they tell me what that is, I say, okay, so what have you done so far in order to solve that? Like, what have you done to get across that finish line? Sometimes during sales calls, you can find out right away that there's a barrier who's a person on the project. And I'll give you an example. One of the sales calls that I was involved with several months ago, somebody said, well, we contacted Microsoft and they just couldn't figure it out. I'm like, okay, that's not unusual, but what do you mean by they couldn't figure it out? Well, they told us to change MacStop. Everybody knows changing MacStop isn't going to fix that. I said, why? How do you know that? Like, well, it's just common sense. I said, is it hard to change MacStop? Well, no, it only takes a few seconds. Then why don't you do it? Even if you don't believe it's going to solve the problem, and you might be right, why don't you do what the expert who you hired and paid told you to do? Because if you do believe they're incompetent, then wouldn't that prove they were incompetent almost immediately? Well, I guess I could. Okay, so I don't want your money. Because if you fought that other expert that hard for something that was so easy to change and so easy to prove them wrong, why would I waste my time giving you advice that if you don't like it, you're not going to take? I only have one reputation, and I don't want a whole lot of pissed off customers out there. Sure, sooner or later, everybody's going to have some pissed off customers. But if I can see right away from going in that you're going to refuse to do what the outsiders tell you to do and that you have all the answers, great. If you've got all the answers, bon voyage, you're on your own. So that's really the luxury of having the 30-minute sales calls and trying to figure out very quickly what is it that you want and why haven't you done it yet. The other extreme, the extreme that I want to hear when I'm doing a sales call is, we have tried a bunch of things and we are to the point where we admit we don't know how to figure it out. And David, absolutely. So many bosses don't trust their own employees. It's as strange as you say, why hire them? Often I'm brought in as a consultant where managers say the employees want to do this. We want an outside person to tell us whether or not that's smart. And there are times when I'll do it during the sales call. Sometimes I'll say right in the sales call, yep, it sounds like this employee's got it all under control. Go run with what they say. I think it's good. You shouldn't hire me to go figure it out. I've also had sales calls where I've said, I think this person's right. I think this is what you should do. But if you want to pay me to do the due diligence and figure it out for sure and give you written reports with the evidence as to why, then yes, it makes sense to hire me. So it happens to me all the time. If you want to learn more about that, go to brentozar.com and search for Consulting Lines, Lines. I've got a series of blog posts called Consulting Lines where I go through and I talk about some of the lines that I use to diffuse toxic problems out in the workspace. All right, so that is it for this week's office hours. I'm going to go ahead and clear out the questions. I am going to say stop taking messages and erase all messages, just so that way, let me copy that out, make sure I got that. So that way I've got starting fresh so people can put in new ones for the next office hours. It is Labor Day out in the United States. It's a holiday out here where we celebrate by not doing any labor, so I am going to not do any labor. I'm going to get off this call and I'm probably going to go out for brunch. I haven't had brunch yet today. It's already, let's see, what temperature is it out here? 91. It's already 91 degrees. I might be able to go out in a convertible today. I try to get out as early as I can just to go enjoy. I've got a little Porsche Speedster replica convertible that's a whole lot of fun. But on the flip side is there's no air conditioning in it. And it's so low to the ground and the top is so low and chopped that you don't really want to drive it with the top on. So I want to get out before the sun fries me to death. Mankini in the pool. That sounds like a plan. So y'all celebrate. Don't do too much labor today. And I will see y'all at the next office hours. Adios, y'all.